All right, so when last we left off, we were talking about Mr. Shakespeare and how perhaps maybe not the best guy to be married to. Um, Specifically, I was talking about the lost years. Shakespeare's two twins, Judith and Hamnet, are born in 1585. He disappears in printed records until 1592, 7 years later. And when he pops back up, he is now being referred to not in Stratford, where he is from, where he grew up, but in London as part of the London theatre scene. Uh, so, if you're looking at along with the slides with me, if you look at slide number 19, that is a view of London Bridge during the Elizabethan era. The original engraving is done in 1616. Elizabeth I, Britain's Virgin Queen, is pretty much toward the end of her life by the time that Shakespeare gets to London. During the rise of his career and the beginning of the high period of Shakespeare as playwright, that is during Elizabeth's last years. Elizabeth dies, King James I will take over, and the second part of Shakespeare's career involves, James being the king. Shakespeare's family was Catholic, though they would never have said that out loud. And part of the reason why is because of rulers. So, Elizabeth I, let me give you some backstory. So, Elizabeth I's father was King Henry VIII, the big fat guy in all the paintings, right? Henry VIII gets married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon, and he has a problem because Henry is Catholic. Catherine of Aragon is from Spain, a very Catholic country, and Henry's problem is this: you pass your throne along to your son. Genetics determines who's in charge, basically. And so Henry VIII, defender of the Catholic faith for years and years, has a problem because he and his wife Catherine, they have a daughter named Mary, but no son. Henry blames Catherine for the lack of a son, and then proceeds to start petitioning the Pope for an annulment of his marriage, a divorce, basically. The Catholic Church doesn't allow for divorce at this point, so he has to petition the Pope, and he asks the Pope, and Henry asks, can I get divorced? And the Pope says, no, you cannot. Which annoys Henry, right? So Henry, the kings are basically, they feel like they rule by divine right? They're put on the throne. God put them on the throne, special person to oversee all of the non-special people. So Henry's argument is, all right, well, why do my people, God put me on the throne to take care of the English people, why do my people have to go through the Catholic Church to get to God? Shouldn't they just go through me? So Henry embraces the Protestant Reformation that is spreading through parts of Germany, Lutheranism and things like that, and they break off. England breaks off from the Catholic Church and becomes the Anglican Church, the Church of England. The Anglican Church and the Catholic Church are pretty similar, at least in terms of its doctrine, by and large, with one specific, very special difference. It allows for divorce. Now, it's still kind of a chore to get divorced. Like, you have to go through the head of the Church of England and ask for a divorce. So, yeah, it's not, you just can't decide, right? So Henry goes to the head of the Church of England and says, hey, can I get divorced? And it just so happens that the head of the Church of England is the king, so himself. He goes to himself and says, hey, self, can I get divorced? And he says, hell yes, you can. And so he divorces his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and he imprisons her in a castle out of the countryside. So Catherine and his daughter, Mary, go out to the country and remain Catholic in their castle imprisonment. And then Henry VIII marries his longtime mistress, Anne Boleyn, who is Protestant, and then he and Anne start trying to have a kid, and within the first year or so has a kid, but unfortunately for Henry, it's a girl, Elizabeth. She's going to come back in a little bit. So yeah, try as they might, Anne can't produce a son for Henry. Again, Henry blames her for this. And then finally he gets sick of it. And while the whole getting divorced thing was such a pain in the neck the first time, what he does is invent treason charges against Anne Boleyn, and then has her head cut off which enables him to marry again because, oh, my wife is dead, now I can get remarried. 6 wives Henry will ultimately have by the end of his life. One of them does produce a son for him. The son does take over for Henry after he dies, but the son is really sickly. A lot of inbreeding in the British throne and British crown. The son, he takes over at like age 9 or 10. He falls off a horse and dies from the injury by age 11. And so Henry's family, who have all of this power and influence, they have a problem because they don't want to lose their power and influence if somebody else takes over the throne. So they go back to Henry's other children, his daughters, and they go to Henry's oldest child, his oldest daughter Mary, and suddenly England has a queen, Queen Mary. Bloody Mary, she's called. And the reason why is that Mary is Catholic. Now, you have to understand that the religion of the country, you had no choice in it. It was a state-enforced religion. If the king or queen said, you are Catholic, you are Protestant, then you were Catholic or Protestant. And if you weren't, bad things happened to you, right? So Henry decides that the entire country of England is now Anglican, Church of England. When he dies and Mary becomes queen, Mary is Catholic, and she never stopped being Catholic. So Mary gets on the throne and is like, wait, Anglican, Church of England. You know what it sounds like when you say that word to me? It sounds like you're saying that you're a heretic. And Mary proceeds to burn at the stake about 30,000 members of the Anglican Church before people catch on that they are now Catholic again. And that's kind of how it goes. That's why she's called Bloody Mary. Anyway, but it's a problem, this whole, picking your monarch by genetics thing, because Mary and her husband try to have a child. They never do. So Mary's family worries about losing their influence when Mary dies, because she doesn't have children, direct descendants. So, as it happens, they persuade Mary to go to her half-sister, Elizabeth, right, that her father had with his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And Mary basically has imprisoned Elizabeth for her whole life off at a castle out in the countryside in the middle of nowhere. Mary brings Elizabeth to court and says, look, you are either going to walk out that door as the next Queen of England, or I'm going to have you murdered. To be the next Queen of England, you have to promise, you have to make a solemn sworn vow that you will not take the church from the country. You have remain Catholic. Right? And Elizabeth's like 15 at the time. Elizabeth says, I swear solemnly I will not take the church from England. Catholic country, gonna be Catholic country, I promise the country will be Catholic. And then Mary dies, and Elizabeth becomes queen, and then one of the very first things that she does is, Catholic, you keep saying that word Catholic. You know what it sounds like when you say the word Catholic to me? It sounds like you're saying I'm a heretic. And then Elizabeth proceeds to burn people at the stake who are too stupid to now realize that they're back to being Anglican again, because Elizabeth was. Anyway, so Shakespeare's family probably almost certainly were Catholic, but they weren't stupid enough to say that out loud. By the time that Shakespeare arrives in London in the early 1590s, Elizabeth has endured like 5 attempts on her life. Many of them executed by gangs of people hired by the Catholic Church. So yeah, Elizabeth has been there for a while. She's pretty tough. She never marries. She proclaims herself the Virgin Queen, though that is stretching the word virgin way past all measure of meaning. She was certainly not virginal. She had many lovers. She never married. At first, it was to hold out the idea that she could marry somebody from another country and make an alliance. But then once she consolidated her power, she said that she was married to England, and that was all she needed. And so, yeah, she refused to ever get married. She proclaimed herself, I am virgin, and became the Virgin Queen of England, though, again, that she was certainly not. Yeah, so that's the world that Shakespeare is arriving into in London by the time he gets there. He leaves Stratford, Mary, and Anne and the kids behind, and arrives in London. He starts work as an actor, and is doing that for a while before he branches out into the playwriting career. So we have the records of his children's baptism in Stratford in 1585. And the next thing that we have, if you're following along on the slides, slide 20, is in 1592. That's when he reappears into the historical record. And it's because somebody is bashing him in print for being an upstart and basically for being a commoner from the sticks. This poet named Robert Greene, a gentleman with a capital G, wrote this pamphlet called A Groat's Worth of Wit in 1592. You can see the quote there. Let me read it to you. Quote, "There is an upstart crow beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johann Factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country." In other words, damn son, can you feel that sick burn? I mean, scholars differ on the exact meaning of what Greene is saying, but most feel like it's obviously suggesting that university-educated poets and gentlemen, with a capital G, like Robert Greene, were far superior writers compared to Shakespeare, the redneck from the boonies, right? So yeah, 400 years later, and the insult is maybe not as biting as it might have once been, but we know he's talking about Shakespeare for two reasons. Number one, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide" is a line from a Shakespeare play, King Henry VI, Part 3, which is a terrible play and really boring. It's great for curing your insomnia, but that is a line from a Shakespeare play, one of his early plays. And what Greene says, "tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide," is obviously making fun of that line. And then the second reason is that Greene makes a really bad play on words on his name, using the word shake scene. Yeah, he's talking about Shakespeare. So that's how we know. By the way, if you're wondering what of Robert Greene's writing survives, that pamphlet, and the only reason it survives is because he's making fun of Shakespeare. So I guess what I'm saying is, you never know. 400 years later, be careful who you put on blast on Instagram, because, yeah, people will laugh at you like they laugh at Robert Greene. Anyway, I'm getting to the point. The point of talking about all this is it allows us to make some educated guesswork about what happened to Mr. Shakespeare during those lost 7 years. His theater career begins probably in the late 1580s. Twins are born in 1585. By 1592, he was already beginning to write plays in addition to being an actor on the London stage, drawing at least enough attention to earn a slam from another writer at the time. From 1594 onwards, Shakespeare's plays begin being performed exclusively by one acting company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. That is named after an officer in the king or queen's court. The Lord Chamberlain is responsible for deciding what would feature as court entertainment for Queen Elizabeth at the time, because the queen can't go see theater in theaters because that's just gross. The theaters of the time, they were used as theaters, yes, but when they weren't being used as theaters, they were also used as stables. So there's horse poop and, straw all over the ground. They were also used as brothels, so any other number of bodily fluids all over the ground. So yeah, the queen can't go see theater in the theater. The Lord Chamberlain will be the one who would decide, all right, you're worthy, you get to go perform in front of Elizabeth in the castle, which that's going to net whatever group that is a lot of favor and a lot of money. So the Lord Chamberlain is a position that people wanted to kiss up to, hence why this company that Shakespeare's a part of calls themselves the Lord Chamberlain's Men. If you look at slide 25, you can see the Lord Chamberlain that we're talking about. His name is Henry Carey. He is the first Baron Hunsdon. He is the patron of the Lord Chamberlain's Men and was Lord Chamberlain for Queen Elizabeth I. He was Elizabeth's cousin, which shows you that, it is all in who you know, even back then. You can tell he's new money because he's the first Baron Hunsdon. When he dies, his son will take over, becoming the Lord Chamberlain. So yeah, that's who they named their group after. They know how to kiss up. Shakespeare's works being performed exclusively by this group is important because it marks the major turning point in his career in the theater world. Shakespeare's plays being performed all the time basically grants him a lot of power, and he rises up to the ranks of this company and then eventually will become part owner of the company. So he drew profits as an owner, as an actor, and as a playwright separately. So basically every time they did one of his shows, he got paid 3 times over. And yeah, eventually they're doing nothing but his shows because he becomes so immensely popular. The biggest salary was, as a owner of the company. That's the full share of profits. Then, because they were performing one of his plays, he would get a check as being the playwright. And because he wasn't stupid, when he wrote a play, he would write a part for himself to play in the play that his company would be performing, so he would get a check as an actor too. He specialized in old man parts. The Lord Chamberlain's men go on to become the most popular of all acting companies in London at the time. When Queen Elizabeth I dies in 1603, she doesn't have any children, virgin queen after all, and so her family doesn't want to lose their power and connection, so they bring over her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, who then becomes King James I of England. You know King James, he's the one who ordered the Bible translated into English the first time. Knowing the fine art of kissing up to people in charge, the Lord Chamberlain's men adopt a new name in 1603. They start calling themselves the King's Men, because why kiss up to middle management? Here's how, on slide 28, the company was laid out. You had 8 owners who received a full share, the biggest check, from all the profits of the company. And then alongside them were 8 to 10 hired guys who were part-time. They would have other jobs, but they would also be brought in to portray all the minor parts and to understudy the major roles. It's like an apprenticeship. If you did it long enough, you graduated in theory to full share. And then finally, there was a small number of young boy players to serve as apprentices to the adult actors and to play all the female roles, anywhere from, 8 to 10 to 14 to possibly later, if your voice didn't drop too bad when you hit puberty. Because, yeah, Juliet and every other female role in Shakespeare was totally played by a dude back then. Audiences, obviously, like with Greek theater and Roman theater, yeah, you've got to have female characters because it would be stupid to do a story without a female in it. But you can't have female playing them because that's just gross. They failed. That would not change until about 1660 or so, well after Shakespeare's body is moldering in the ground. And when it did change, when women started playing the women parts, audiences didn't like it at first because culture is weird. They felt that the women weren't womanly enough on stage. Get that 12-year-old boy in a dress up there. That's how you do a woman. Looking at slide 30, the first Shakespeare actors, Richard Burbage, Will Kemp, Henry Condell, John Hemmings, Robert Armin. These are all original members of his company. Condell, Hemmings, and Armin are the ones who decide to collect the plays of Shakespeare into one volume and publish them not long after his death. That's the first folio. Blame those guys for having to suffer through all this because they're the reason why we have his stuff. Looking at slide 31, that's the performance space in the English Renaissance, right? These big outdoor performance spaces. They are, if you look at them overhead, they're like a big wooden O from overhead. The stage is covered by a roof, but everything else is kind of open to the elements. The Lord Chamberlain's men originally performed in a theater space called, creatively, the Theater, from 1594 through 1597. They had landlord problems, and that forced them to move in 1597 to a nearby theater called the Curtain, which is where all the early plays of Shakespeare are kind of performed, the early great plays. There's a movie called Shakespeare in Love, if you've ever seen that. They're in the Curtain at that point. By 1599, they are profitable enough that they construct their own playhouse, which you definitely should know. It's called the Globe, and you want to know that one of all of them, because that's where all the great plays are performed, in the Globe. Funny story about the Globe. They were in the Curtain, and what happened is they were having issues with the landlord, and so they pulled an Ocean's 11 style heist. Like, they had some prostitutes get the landlord of that building real drunk, have a great time one night, and when he woke up the next morning and went to his building, it was gone. They basically went to the building, they broke it down, they stole everything. The costumes, the props, the sets, the lumber, they stole the building. And they took all that stuff across the river to this new location that they had bought the rights to use, and then they recreated that theater called the Globe there. So yeah, you could see a view of the reconstructed Globe Theater. It reopened in 1997 nearby where they thought it was originally. They were a little off, but within 100 yards. And yeah, all plays are performed during the daytime. There's no artificial lighting at this point, and torches, not the best idea. These buildings are wooden structures, and they've got, all this dry straw all over the ground to cut down on the smell of the horse poop and any other things there. So, they were performing a play called Henry VIII, and in this performance, they fired off a cannon in salute to the actor who's playing Henry VIII coming on stage. The gunpowder sparked. There was no cannonball, but the gunpowder sparked. The sparks hit the dry straw. The straw went up on fire, and then the fire spread to the walls, and then the whole Globe Theater burned down during the middle of one performance, which, to be fair, that was going to be way more interesting than what they were watching, because that play sucks. So yeah, artificial lighting, not the best. So all plays are being performed, usually, for the most part, in the daytime, because torches and dry wooden structures, not the best combination. If you were rich or upper middle class, you could pay for a seat along the rings. If you're looking at slide 35, you can see that there are 3 tiers, rings around that circle everything. I say seat. Really, they're like the most uncomfortable, miserable wooden benches to sit on ever. They would rent you a cushion to sit on to make it more comfortable. But most of the audience is standing out there in front of, at the sides of the stage. These are the groundlings. That's where the common people, where most of the audience was going to be. And yeah, standing, there are no seats. You stand up the whole time. That group was called the groundlings. They sold refreshments, food, alcohol, and everything while you're watching, so it made it less miserable, I guess, to stand there. Anyway, theater was much more interactive back then. Like, it would be, the audience would shout, they would cheer, they would boo, they would hiss, they would, like, shout things at the actors performing on stage. So it was much less, you know, sacred, and much less they were watching Shakespeare the way that we do. It's much more interactive, is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, after the Globe burned down, Shakespeare's group moved over to a new theater called the Blackfriars Theater, which was indoors. It was a smaller indoor theater that was built specifically to have indoor performances. They started using that exclusively in 1609, and that became their sole performance venue. Because there are fewer seats, they charge a higher admission price and start relying more on special effects and stuff to draw audiences in. But because it's a theater that's designed for indoor performances, they can perform all during the day, not just in daytime. It's built with torches going in mind. So yeah, shifting gears for a second back to Shakespeare's life. You know, he had this titanic, amazing rise to prominence through the 1590s into the 1600s. But it was marked with tragedy because Shakespeare's son Hamlet dies in August of 1596 of unknown causes. Hamlet was 11 when he died. Shakespeare spent no time with Hamlet, with the boy. I mean, he didn't live with him. He, you know, sent money back and took care of his entire family. But yeah, he never lived with Hamlet. But clearly, Hamlet's death preys on Shakespeare because the writing around that time period starts to get darker and darker, culminating in, you know, the great tragedies. One of which is called Hamlet, which, yeah, that plays about fathers and sons and legacy, and yeah, it's about his dead son. Anyway, by 1597, Shakespeare's wealthy enough to buy a new house for Anne and the girls back in Stratford. By 1613, Shakespeare leaves London, he retires, and returns to living full-time in Stratford, and then he dies on April 23rd, 1616. Consider for a moment, Shakespeare came from nothing. He was a country boy with barely any education, 7 years of school. But by the end of his life, he was rich, he was popular, he was celebrated. He has 2 graves, actually. One in Westminster Abbey, alongside of kings and queens of England, and then his actual body is at Stratford upon Avon, where he was from and where he died in. I will mention this, too, at this moment. It's not in the slides, but Shakespeare's will is fascinating. Like, he knew he was passing away. He knew he was getting ill. So 1 month before he dies at the end of April. In March, he called his attorney to his home, and he very, very carefully, litigiously goes through and creates a last will and testament to, you know, parcel out his many, many worldly possessions and his wealth. Most of his wealth and estate went to his oldest daughter, Susanna. Judith, the other surviving daughter, the younger one, got the rest of it, bulk-wise. Like heirloom items, like, you know, a sword he gave to, like, his best friend. He gave the poor of Stratford. a set amount of money. I don't know how the poor were expected to collect that money, but yeah, he left money for the poor of Stratford, which is great. To his wife, Anne Hathaway, who he married when he was 18, who was still his wife at the age when he died at 52. They stayed married the entire time, left her behind to raise the kids in Stratford when he went off to London. He left in the late 1580s, early 1590s, did not come back home permanently until 1613. Yeah, to his wife Anne, he left the second best bed. Period. That's what he left his wife in his will. The second best bed. The best bed was the bed that you reserved for guests to sleep in, so he left her the bed that she slept in. That's what he left. So maybe not the greatest husband to be married to. I find that amazingly humanizing and horrible. Will Shakespeare, genius writer, kind of a dick to be married to. Anyway, we'll come back and talk about the language in just a sec, but yeah. So that's the life story, and the thing about it is, a lot of that people just forget about when they are studying the plays, because you get caught up in Shakespeare, right? No, he's a guy. He's a guy who had family problems, who seemingly wasn't the nicest guy in the world to be married to. He went through triumph and tragedy the same way that, we all do. We lose sight of that, and I think that, too, is part of the reason why people have a hard time relating to his works, because he feels so above, non-human. No, but he was a guy. He was a normal human guy with the normal kind of human frailty problems and issues that he combated. It's just that his writing sort of sails past everybody else's. Anyway, we'll come back and talk about the writing in a second and discuss why that Mr. Shakespeare has more in common with modern day hip-hop artists than he does with modern day playwrights. Come back for that.